All right. So once again, hello, everyone. My name is Manisha. I'm the Director of Health Professions Advising, and we are doing day 3 of interview week. We're going to be talking about behavioral and situational judgment type interview questions. And so before we go any further, I wanted to ask you all, what have you heard and what do you know about these two different types of interview questions? And you can either unmute or put them in the chat. Okay. So Angelina, I appreciate your honesty. Hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you'll know a whole lot more. Jason, that is correct. With situational, similar to what you might see on Casper. Yep, they can, as Ryman mentioned, they can be healthcare or just general ethics. Thank you. So these types of questions are the most common interview approaches. Behavioral question, really the idea is they're going to ask you questions so that you recall a past experience and describe what you did, how you handled it, how you addressed it. Situational interview questions are going to present you with a hypothetical and ask how you would handle it. So the main difference is one focuses on how did you do something, one focuses on how would you do something. And there is no interview that's going to be all one or the other than maybe like Casper, which is a online meant to be only situational. During a live interview, I would expect both types of questions to be presented to you. So to delve a little bit more into behavioral interviews, the concept behind it is how past performance is an indicator of future performance. So interviewers are listening to how you handled past events, but more so what you learned from them, both your actions and learned moments, as a predictor of how you might react or perform in a future situation. If you're presented with something similar or the same, how are you going to react or act in them? They're listening for competencies and attributes. How did you think? What is your willingness to learn? How are you in a team environment? The professionalism you displayed or didn't display, but again, tacking on what did you learn? Are you a self-starter? Do you take initiative? And what your self-awareness is from how you responded to the situation. Again, self-awareness being connected to what did you learn or grow from this situation. So when you think about your responses, you want to think about specific examples. To be honest, it's really hard to think about specific examples on the spot, to really figure out, okay, what of my past is the best way to answer this. So in preparation for your interview and any types of questions, you can't know what they'll ask. You can't predict what they'll ask, but you can prepare for general ideas, questions related to teamwork and leadership, questions related to difficult situations, questions related to weaknesses or failures, questions related to strengths and when you've been proud about something or how you handled something well. So you can think about major categories of questions and then think about a few examples based on what you might actually be asked and what is the best example for you to put in to share that day. Again, when you think about those 15 competencies through AAMC, those are going to give you guidelines of categories to prepare for, to be able to speak about. And then figuring out how best, what's the best example to answer. Again, thinking about your responses, as I've been saying for the past couple of days, you do want to follow a formula. Like, there is no formula for answering, but you do want to, follow a guideline. Using this format is the best way to, one, ensure you are in fact answering the question. You're not derailing, meaning you're not necessarily starting off with the answer and getting derailed with a side thought. And then as the listener, your interviewer will appreciate you laying out the situation in a very strategic way. I know there's a lot of acronyms out there. You might have heard about CAR, STAR, PAR. I specifically like PARCA. You can use whatever you want that will help you structure your answers. But with PARCA, the idea is briefly state the situation, brief. Now, if the situation involves you being part of a team, relay what the goal of the team was, and then focusing on your part in that situation. Action you took. What did you specifically do? What was your contribution? If it's related to a problem or challenge, what was your contribution in that problem or challenge? Or what action did you take because of the problem that was stated? What happened because of what you did? Now, again, if you were part of a team, there might be many things happening because of your responses as a team. But again, hone in on you. Because of my contribution, my actions, here's what happened based on my part of the solution. And then finally, what did you learn? What did you learn because of the way, because of the situation, because of the way you handled the situation, because of what happened? And then when appropriate, how might you apply what you learned to the future? What might you do if this arose again? And that you would add that final A, that application, you would only add if appropriate based on the way they asked you the question. So again, you don't necessarily want to have to think of things on the spot. If you do, take that moment, think about it, but use a formula or use a structure for answering, again, to keep yourself from derailing. Now, should you derail, you start off answering and you lead off, in a different direction, hopefully you recognize it. Pause. Apologize. I'm so sorry. I think I got off track. And then come back. If you realize you're not even answering the question, same thing. Acknowledge it. I'm so sorry. I don't think I'm answering this question. Is it okay if I start again? That shows, again, when we think about those competencies and attributes, that shows that self-awareness, right? That's really important. Oh my goodness, I'm off track. So even if you started off in the wrong direction, recognizing it, acknowledging it, shows your recognition and self-awareness. I'm going to pause here. Any questions for me thus far? Anything related to answering these questions? Anything related to thinking of examples, structuring? If you do derail, anything that I could answer before we move on? Okay. So there are many different types of behavioral questions. And as someone mentioned, they can be health related or just general. By no means is this an exhaustive list, and you can readily Google, medical school interview questions, behavioral interview questions, and you'll get many lists that show you examples. Again, you're trying to look at these major categories: adaptability, problem solving, teamwork, communication, motivation, challenge, failure, resilience, success. You can, what you're looking at is these broad categories, and then your goal is to think about examples of how you would answer, or what examples would you provide based on major categories. In looking at some examples of these questions, do you have any questions like, how would I approach this? I'm not sure how I might get started. I know yesterday we talked about the general, tell me about yourself. How might you do that based on how it's framed? If it's tell me about yourself, or if it's tell me about yourself and why you want to be a blank. There's different approaches for both of those. But in thinking about forming your answers or thinking of examples, do you have any questions, or are there, things that you're concerned, should I even bring these ideas up? And while you're thinking, I want to spend a moment on about challenge, failure, and resilience. Thank you, Angelina. That's exactly where I wanted to talk about. There's a concept out there, and I think it's a misperception, that you have to turn your challenge or failure into a success. You have to turn it around and make it a strength. And I think that's wrong. I think, one, I'm going to start off with, please don't pick a catastrophic personality failure, right? You don't want to, with a weakness, you don't want to say, yeah, I'm a habitual procrastinator, right? Using those words, big no-no. That sounds like a catastrophic personality defect. But there's other ways to speak about it. So if one of your weaknesses, you want to bring up is a variation of procrastination, I might say something like, in the past, sometimes I've struggled starting off a project that maybe isn't so interesting to me. I know that, so you're stating it in a way that's not catastrophic. You're saying, if I'm not interested, I sometimes struggle starting. Then you want to lead with, you want to go into, why is this a problem? When this has happened, for example, I was part of a group. My part of the project included creating a timeline for when we wanted to accomplish specific tasks. I do prefer to have more big picture, and so sitting down and creating a timeline isn't always my strength, and I fell behind. So why is this a problem? I fell behind. This led to my team members becoming upset, because if I did not do my part, they could not do theirs. So you're stating why this is a problem. From there, I worked really hard. So it's still I'm talking about a weakness, especially in projects that I don't enjoy, to upfront create a timeline, create a calendaring system to keep myself accountable. This has helped me, and it's something I continue to work on. So I haven't turned around and made this a success. I haven't turned around and made this something that's really a strength. So many times people will say, have you heard this example? A weakness of mine is I take on a lot of projects. Have you heard that one, where people might say, I take on a lot of projects? And why is this a weakness? I would turn around and ask. Because usually they follow up with, and that's just because I like to do a lot of things. And sometimes I become overwhelmed, but I ultimately finish everything. If this were a weakness question, can you tell me about a weakness of yours? Have I in fact addressed this as a weakness, if that's the response I'm giving? No, I've turned around and made it a strength. So if I am the interviewer listening for a weakness because I'm trying to understand your self-awareness and resilience, have you in fact done that, if that's the response you're giving? No. So this would be something where you turn around and say why this is a problem. So one of the weaknesses or challenges that I have is I tend to take on too many projects. This really became noticeable when at work in my research, my two different PIs gave me two different projects. And I said yes to both of them. I started both projects. However, the deadlines were also occurring at the same time. And I missed the deadline in one, ending up requiring 100 of the research mice to be put down because I missed the protocol. Now I've stated why this is a problem. What I realized that I have to be very clear on understanding deadlines. I have to be very clear of speaking to what's on my plate and not taking on more than I can reasonably accomplish, or providing an alternative timeline if that is at all possible. So part of that learning moment when those mice, and this is somebody's real life example, I had to, my PI as a learning moment had me sacrifice those mice. And I realized in seeing myself put down those mice, I realized the impact of my failure to follow through. And that really came to head for me that day. So I am saying why this was a failure or a weakness. I am saying what happened because of my failure. I'm speaking to what I learned, and I'm also going to add what I've done in the future. So to the questions, how to answer questions and giving example, when you had to be persuasive, okay, or Lyra, I'm going to come back to you, but Hema, when you had to be persuasive. So this is asking when you had to convince someone of something, when you had to explain something to someone so that they understood why you wanted it to be done a certain way. So that is what they mean by when you had to be persuasive. Is it, you had an idea, or you realized something had to happen a certain way and somebody wasn't necessarily understanding. So those are alternatives. If you aren't in customer service or sales, it's hard. So you want to think about a time, okay, from my experience, this is why I'm suggesting we proceed a certain way. Lyra, to your question related to our professional career, I think you can pull things from, I'm going to answer this in a different way. I would avoid personal examples unless you think it's absolutely necessary or appropriate. So I would think about academics. I would think about group work. I would think about student group related activities, and I would think about work situations. Now, when I say that, it doesn't have to be health related. Maybe you work in food services, right? And you're thinking of an example from there, or you're pulling an example from your student group. I would avoid you and a friend or you and a family member as much as possible, unless that is, in your mind, the best example for a specific type of question. Anything else? Any other questions? And we'll go through more examples. Today's about examples. But anything else, other questions that you, oh yes, perfectionist. Thank you. That's the same thing as taking on too much. So why is this is an example? Absolutely. Why, how can perfectionism be an example of a weakness? Now, Jason, thinking about the example I shared about taking on too many projects, how could using perfectionist or a variation of that word, how can you show that is a problem? And again, if you're comfortable unmuting, I'll share an example, but I want to see if you can. Yes, Angelina, taking too long to start or taking too long to finish, causing a project to stall, redoing other people's work in a project. How many of you had that done where somebody went in, swooped in, and was like, no, I want it done this way, and they actually redid your work without communicating? That is when being a perfectionist, but I might use another, that's when it is a problem as an example of a weakness, is when you've basically annoyed people or redone work or missed deadlines. And then what are you doing about it? Right? I am staying in my lane. I am delegating. Or when a project has been divided up, delegating, I'm focused on my part. I'm communicating with my team members how I'm proceeding to help me be accountable. But you must state why something is a weakness. Lyra, I don't know. Subjectively objective is a good way I might say it, because you're speaking about yourself. And if something, and this is where I'm going to turn on the video for a second as I'm answering, if something in fact is a problem, I'm going to show that on my face, like, goodness. So, you know, one of the challenges I have is wanting something to be done as perfectly as possible. Now, this became a problem a few years back when I was on a team, and I had lost focus of the big picture and realized I was delaying conclusion of that project. My team members sat me down, and moving forward from there, I, tried very much to communicate with my team, both of us communicating back and forth to ensure completion, and that I don't become so singularly focused. And it's been helping. While I still, enjoy things being perfect to an extent, I also realize my definition of perfect may not be everyone's definition. So do you see how I'm not emotional, but I am letting them see my, what's the word I'm using for? My learned moments, my embarrassment, my realization. I am showing that on my face. So when I think of objectivity, I'm thinking of robotically. So there was a time that I was on a project, and I really wanted things to go a certain way. It can be monotonous or robotic. We want to show that embarrassment. We want to show our understanding of our mistake and failure. That is what being human is about. We want to show those learned moments and that realization. We don't want to be robotic. We don't want to be emotional. I think that's the better way. If an example you're thinking about in a behavioral question is going to make you angry, upset, or cry, or have to gasp to get it out, that is probably, if it's going to trigger something in you, that is probably not an example to use. I'm going to say pick something different. With an example of resilience, I've seen people use an example of when they were a survivor of a crime. Well, it's hard to be completely objective, but they're showcasing their way. I've also seen when somebody, right, it's too fresh. It's going to appear too fresh, and that you haven't, in fact, addressed everything behind it, but we also don't want to be robotic in our answer. Does that help in understanding kind of that fine line of what to use and maybe what not to use? You want to think about how fresh it's going to be. You still want them to understand, this meant something, but if it's going to trigger you, we probably don't want to use it. If you're struggling with coming up, so the question in the chat is, what if I can't think of something? In all honesty, I have timed people in terms of how long they took, and it has never been more than 7 to 15 seconds. I know it's going to feel like an ages for you. It's going to feel like an eternity. You're going to be like sweating, but I want you to try very hard. If you are really at that point where you've sat for a bit and you can't come up with something, rarely I would use, I would invoke the, I'm so sorry, I'm struggling coming up with an example right now. Is it okay if we move on, and can I circle back to this? You can use that. I would be sensitive of not using that frequently, and I would try really hard to come up with a close of an example as you could. There was a question that came up direct, so I'm going to respect the privacy of the individual. So let me kind of sum up the question. The question is related to understanding the applicant's understanding of cultural diversity. Okay, so the question is related to a situation in a work environment where because of cultural differences of how this person was treated, it led to some mental health challenges at the time. However, this person's indicating that now that they're okay, they feel confident in talking about it. I would say that's fine. If it's appropriate for the question, I would absolutely say I struggled with it. Focusing on how did you address it, right? How I utilized my resources. I spoke with my colleagues. I spoke with HR. I sought out help. And I now know I have the tools to speak up about a situation so that I am not taken to that level of mental health challenge. So I think in a situation like that, it could be appropriate, especially if I think it would be completely appropriate. And I want to be very clear. If something very challenging happened, it is really important that you understand that is your story to share, and it is your story to tell. My point is you want to say it in a way that it's not fresh. It can still hurt. It can still cause pain. And you can say, sometimes when I think about it, it is hurtful. But it is one thing to say it in that way, that it is hurtful, and let them hear that. It is something different to weep or tear up because of the situation. That is fresh, and that's going to feel unresolved, and that is going to question your readiness to be going to graduate school, not the if, the when, right? If something is so fresh that you are crying on the spot, that you are angry and your voice is raising, they're going to question the resolution, the learned moment, the self-awareness. For example, I had in a mock interview, not actually a mock interview, this was a real situation. I think I've mentioned I used to be an interviewer for Stanford for their MMIs in the past. I had a candidate actually shout at me during the 8 minutes he was sitting in front of me because of how incited he became of the interview question. He did not even, like, I'm going to show you my body language. Like, we are sitting in a patient room. That's where they do it, right? So it's maybe 8 by 10 room, if that. He is 2 feet away from me, yelling at me, and I'm sitting there going, and I've actually like moved my chair back to get as far away as humanly possible. His yelling was so bad. I mean, no one interrupted the interview because they saw I had myself handled, that I wasn't like waving, because they're recorded, right? The MMIs are recorded. But afterwards, somebody came in and they're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Well, I'm fine. It's nothing different than I haven't seen before, but yeah, this person's not getting a good rating." And in fact, I spoke with the dean. I was one of 4 people that spoke up because of this person's inability to handle themselves. They were getting incited by an interview question. There's one thing to be passionate. There's one thing to sit there and be like, "And that is not okay." I'm like, yo, you clearly have unresolved issues. I don't see you becoming a doctor anytime soon until this is addressed. And so I be aware of that, right? If something's going to incite you, don't use that example. Don't use that example. And separately, maybe we need to deal with it. But that's happened in a mock interview, that happened in a real interview. I never realized what a low score for an MMI would be until I met that person. Because I'm like, y'all are doing pretty decent, until I met that person. I'm like, oh, that is what a not okay person looks like. And we'll talk more about MMIs tomorrow, but think of examples. I don't want you to be dispassionate, because no one wants to sit across from someone who's robotic, but it shouldn't incite you. Any questions? And to be fair, I can think of examples in my own life that I know I would not use, because they trigger me. They trigger me. I've resolved it, but if I start talking more about it over a minute or two, I'm going to be like, agitated again. So be aware, self-awareness. So we're going to talk about situational judgment. And again, once the presentation's over, we can talk more about specifics, but situational judgment, these are the what ifs, right? What would you do's? Casper is an example. The concept behind it is that it supposedly helps a school obtain a more reliable and meaningful assessment of your personal competencies based on how you might respond to situations. Each one of us has a unique perspective formed by our own experiences. The idea is this gives a more holistic view, but also helps schools identify more diversity within the class they're forming, based on our individual beliefs, values, and experiences. That's what we're using to answer some of these questions. And so that's what's behind it. So Casper's an example, PreView's an example. but it's also an idea to determine your behavioral tendencies and what your future people skills looks like. So Casper, like I mentioned, is an example that's used. It was, medicine. Casper was designed by the same folks who developed multiple mini interviews, MMIs, and more schools are using this. Quickly, it's 12 stations of hypothetical, either written or video, with 3 open-ended questions per station, 5 minutes to respond. Again, it's assessing your non-cognitive abilities, looking more at your interpersonal skills, empathy, compassion, communication, and how you might act in a difficult and future situation. The nice thing, like multiple mini interviews, is each section is unique, has a unique rater. So if you make a few mistakes, your next station is a reset. You get no one knows how you did in the previous station, you get a reset. You're being evaluated based on responses per station, not overall. So this is an example. Out of curiosity, has anyone taken Casper yet? Okay. So you've experienced that. So think of, have you taken PreView yet? Okay. So 2 different examples, right? 2 different examples. They're structured differently, but the idea is the same. They're just trying to look at your interpersonal skills and how you perceive different situations. This isn't a Casper example. Generally with Casper, you are the main character in the situation. And how would you handle this? So with the verbal, you would answer verbally. With the written, you have 5 minutes to answer the 3 questions. But that is the approach, is how would you handle it? If you go on Casper's website and look up the examples they give, one is, about paternity leave. Again, and one is about customer service and retail. So someone with retail experience might answer it one way. Somebody who doesn't have retail might answer it differently. With the paternity leave, somebody who has been in a situation might answer it one way, someone who hasn't this way. If someone has had something of theirs ever stolen, might have certain perceptions of how they would answer this, or have certain beliefs about social media. So again, it's the diversity. There's no right or wrong. It's justify it. What's behind what you would do. So a little bit about PreView for those who haven't taken it. All schools are invited to use it. One DO school currently uses it, Des Moines. Your scores are automatically updated for exams taken since 2020. You can only take it once per year. So if you applied last year, so if you took it 20 or 1 per testing year, so if you took it, you can 2020 to 2022 anytime, you're eligible again now. Same thing with Casper. You could, it doesn't roll over, you would take it again. An example of the formats are written scenarios with hypothetical dilemmas based on real situations, can be healthcare, education, other settings. Following the scenarios are possible actions, and then you rate the effectiveness of those actions. Here's an example of a question, and you would go through and rate how each one of these, what level of effectiveness is it? For the folks who took Casper PreView, is there anything you'd be willing to share in terms of for the folks that still need to take it? And you can always throw something in the chat, or we can talk about it later. But that's what it looks like. In terms of scoring, there are no throwaway questions, so everything counts. Full credit is awarded if your response matches the medical educator's response, partial if your answer is close. Percentile rankings of scores are the percentage of test takers who receive the same or lower scores. If you elected to have your exam score, your score report will include your total, confidence band, percentile, and any applicable notes. They're not going to give you, AAMC is not going to give you scores over the phone. One of the things that I've heard about a preview is think about it from a competency perspective. What competency do you think they're looking for? And then answer the question. In general, I know we talked about examples of behavioral questions. Here are some examples that you might get in an oral interview, in a live interview, in terms of situational questions. So we're no longer talking about Casper or preview, but if you're sitting with someone in an interview. And so remember behavioral, what have you done? In a situational, what would you do? Now, if for any reason you have lived one of the experiences, I would still answer what I would do in this case is, and then you can add on. I actually experienced this 3 months ago, and here's how I handled it. Or because of the way I handled it, I realized I wanted to handle it a different way. Therefore, this is how I would handle it moving forward. You might also, at some point in the interview, be asked how you learn. And these are two common ways medical schools or health professional schools might talk about their learning style or their teaching style. So just be familiar. Because you might be asked, how do you learn? What environment do you learn best? And so be familiar with how the school teaches and how this supports your type of learning. I'm going to quickly go through just some reviewing from the last 2 days, and then I'll sum up things to consider when you're preparing your responses overall. Again, be prepared for multiple types of interview questions, multiple interviews, multiple formats, whether the interviewer knows something about you or not, if it's open or blind. Be prepared for questions about anything from your background or just in general. Follow-up questions, so think of examples, practice them, talk about what you learn anything you can about the school, and then if it's appropriate, connect your responses back to that school or field if it makes sense. Review your application. I promise you're not going to remember the nuances of your application, so do review anything you wrote. Do your research about the school. Make the best thing that you can do is try to turn that back and forth, that Q&A, into more of a dialogue where the interviewer is engaging with you. When you ask questions, whether it's to the professional student or to the faculty, think of something you can't find online, but that might engage them. Something that might engage a faculty member. What research do they do? What have they seen in successful students? What do they enjoy best about being at the school? Similarly with the professional student, what surprised you? What do you like best about being here? What are some things you're involved with? So ask things that show you're interested, but also things you would want to know. If I were to go somewhere for 3 to 4 years, I would want to know something more about the environment I'm about to jump into. And then thinking about the end of your interview. Again, remember to be professional and courteous throughout. You never know who has an opinion or who has a say about you. Be aware of your body language as you're speaking, whether it's virtual or in person. Like, watch your fatigue level. I am introverted. My fatigue shows if I'm not careful. I take breaks seriously when I'm given a break during an interview to like center, recharge. And then after the interview, I know I'm going to be out of it. So I'm going to remove myself from the situation because my fatigue is going to kick in quickly. Be clear and thought out. If you need to pause during your responses to keep the flow and content singularly focused, then do that. Don't feel like you have to jump in right out the gate. Take a few seconds to structure your answer and then respond. If you need to take a break to then add more content, do so. Don't just feel like you have to keep talking. And then follow up with questions that are well thought out. Conversations are more engaging, and you'll learn more about the school and if it's a right school for you. In terms of thank you, that's a really good question. If the person you're interviewing is willing to give you their contact information, yes, I would absolutely email a thank you or send a thank you at the end. If it's an MMI style where you're not really going to get everyone's emails, you can send it to admissions or to the coordinator to share with the rest of the people that were interviewing you. But yes, you do want to send a thank you. If for any reason you are going in person for any of your interviews, here's a cool trick. Actually take physical thank you cards with you. And after your interview, go aside to a coffee shop or somewhere nearby, write them out and leave them. That is such a cool thing to do. And as someone who rarely gets a thank you note, to get something hand delivered or mailed or to actually open up a thank you card, we're all technological these days, right? To actually get a card feels good. You can also do that for any interview if you mail it out day of. So the day of your interview, just mail it out, right? We rarely get something in our hands anymore. Everything's an email. Emails I'll file away. I might forget about them, but thank you notes, I actually have space in my office that I put them up, and it's like, oh, it's that moment of aw. And it's nice because we rarely get paper snail mail. So if you are going to do that, have it ready, stamped, and ready to go day of, because snail mail, US Postal Service, bless them, they're not so fast these days. So be ready to mail them out day of, write your notes day of, refer to something in the conversation. No, it's realistic for virtual interviews, William. If you have your thank you notes right there, your interview's done. Let's say you were talking with a faculty and they mentioned something really, there's something memorable. So thank you so much for taking the time to interview me. I really appreciated hearing about. Write it out, stamp, mail it, same day. It's realistic for any of them. You can send an email overall to admissions, but you could also mail something or mail it the day of. They'll get it in 2 or 3 days. I would not wait beyond day of because how slow snail mail is. But again, it's always, we talk to recruiters all the time and they're like, we rarely get something in our hands anymore. because anything you email gets put in your electronic file. So unless admission shares it with everyone, there's no one really gets it. And plus, referring to something personal, whether you do it via email or in a handwritten note, that's how you remind them of who you are. If it was a professional student, when you shared about blank, that's something I hadn't thought of and makes me even more committed to blank school and know that it's the right choice for me. So when you do write that thank you, customize it, but have that ready to go, not a day or two later, but ready to go either way. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to stop the recording.